What up, though? If you know, you know. Detroit is in the building. Yes, family. This episode is special. We have one of the most important thinkers at the intersection of culture, at the intersection of behavior and brand on the show. Today's guest is Dr. Marcus Collins. He is a marketing professor at the University of Michigan, Roth School of Business. Yes, a formal digital strategist for Beyonce. Yes, he's with us this morning, and one of the clearest voices helping us to understand that people do not buy products, they buy meaning. It's all about cultural meaning making. And so we're going to get into it. He's going to also share with you two great thinkers in this particular category of meaning making. So stay tuned. Dr. Marcus Collins. So we're going to get right into it. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. And so, of course, you know, I got the book For the Culture. What a wonderful piece of work, right? That I've been able to delve into and really get some understanding around how to think about culture and so forth. So I wanted to just, you know, open it up for you to tell us a little bit about yourself for our audience who may not know but need to get familiar with yourself, Marcus.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, guys. My name is Marcus Collins. I'm a professor. I study culture and its influence and impact on human behavior. I spent the majority of my career in the world of marketing as a strategist, as a practitioner. But these days now, I spend my time thinking about how culture not only influences consumption, but how it helps organizations unify their efforts so that their collective production of work leads to greater outcomes. I wrote a best-selling book called For the Culture just over 2 years ago. And since then, my aperture of how I think about the world has widened significantly. And thankfully, my impact on industry has grown significantly as well. So I consider myself to be very, very fortunate.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And of course, we share some background, both being from Detroit.
Yes,
so
sir.
we talk about culture and language. There's some things that we both would say that's known in the vernacular, like "What up, though?"
That's right. That's how we greet each other.
It's kind of like saying how you're doing, or what's up, etc. So one of the things I wanted to ask and delve into when I was reading the book, one of the things that stood out to me was these 3 different laws that you talked about. And I was really meditating on this. You talk, and it teaches us too about like innovation and how things move when we talk about culture. So we had the Sarnoff's law that you talked about. And at that time, that was like wow, like, okay, this is how these connections can happen, right? But then you had the Metcalfe's law and then the Reed's law that really brought it home. We talk about belonging. And so when we think about that evolution of things and bringing it to today, can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, well said. What we're really getting at here is the idea of network effects. And the notion here is that you can activate one person or a small group of people, and what they do reverberates into their population. And Cernoff, brought forward an imagination about networks that was like a broadcast network. Think, Comedy Central. The more people who watch Comedy Central, the more valuable the network becomes. And the typology of that network is hub and spoke. There's something in the middle and more nodes connected to it, and therefore you get a broader, bigger impact and its value. But then Metcalfe rather said, well, listen, having this background of the internet, and he created the Ethernet cable, he understands how computer networks come together to exchange ideas. And he goes, actually, a more valuable network is where you decentralize it. And it's not a hub and spoke situation, but rather they're intermediaries that connect different nodes to other nodes. And therefore, transaction becomes the greatest value, not just visibility or reach, i.e. a broadcast network, but the facilitation of pass along from one node to another, right? You get a greater network effects. Totally. Then David Reed later said, well, actually what's most powerful about the Metcalfe law isn't just the decentralization of networks, the ability to share from person to person to person, i.e. like email or something like Airbnb. where we're able to exchange dollars for currency for products, but it's our ability and our proclivity and inclination as humans to connect with people who are like us. And in these tribal networks, these network effects that connect people who are more so homogeneous, like self-loving, most like ourselves, then we are more inclined to create communities, to facilitate communities, and the network effects there are exponential in their value as opposed to linear in a Metcalfe law network, and even more shallow in a Chernoff law network.
Absolutely, that was powerful. Thank you so much for walking us through that. Really getting to that point of like belonging, as it were. When you talk about tribes, is one of the things I was thinking, about as well. Like, so you find these tribes, and these tribes then make up, a congregation. For example, I like the way that you explained it. You talk about the Philippians and the Corinthians and the Romans, etc. But all of these different tribes made up the Christian congregation at that time. And I really think that's a clear way to help people understand how those effects, as it were, come together when we talk about conviction or what a person believes. And so I want to talk a little bit more about that aspect. You was the digital strategist for Beyonce, and I really liked the lesson you explained in the book about, because we talk a lot about that today, building community. You hear everybody, you got to build community. And you talk about, well, maybe we facilitate it. So can you give us some nuance there about building community versus facilitating?
Yeah, I mean, it's one would call it hair splitting on the surface, but when you get down to the meat and potatoes of it all, you realize just how distinctive this idea is. When we go into a market, we're going to build a community where you are the totem-like object that everything is going to descend around. And it's a very inward-facing, rather, endeavor. This is about us, and we're going to have people come around us, and we're going to build for that. We facilitate community, it's outward-facing, it's about them. And we use our resources to help them come together. And why does this matter? We think about our job as marketers is to get people to adopt behavior, to get people to move. And who are the most influential people in the world? People like us, our people. There are networks of people who descend within congregations, right? So to your point, I use the metaphor of congregations like a church because you have different families that are inside one, ideological umbrella, right? Literally, in a church, they're made up of a congregation that are made up of different families. You got the Collinses, the Hintons, the Ewings, the Davises, and the Finleys, right? They are all individual collectives under a broader idea. And the same thing goes, we think about segmentation and targeting. If I'm looking at athletes as my target, I will talk to basketball players different than I would swimmers or gymnasts or runners or field hockey. However, I can talk to them all in one clip through the same ideological appeal, such that when I'm talking to tennis players, basketball players can see themselves in it. So this notion of seeing people not based on the demographic makeups that typically become the labels for who they are, Gen Z, African-American women, Hispanic males, these sort of boxes that we put people in, but instead seeing them for how they self-identify, their cultural subscription, which of course is far more accurate in its depiction of who they are, but also it is telling of what they're likely to do because of how influential those people are to us. So we should be targeting people based upon their tribal association, which is informed by cultural conventions that are expectations for people like them. It's a completely different paradigm shift of how we think about targeting. And when we start to think about people through that lens, through who they truly are, we are now more inclined, more empowered, more enabled to serve them. based on who they are, which moves us from a place of let's build community around us to let's facilitate community around them and use our resources and our intimacy, our knowledge about who they are to engage them in a much more meaningful way.
That's powerful. Thank you so much for unpacking that for us. And I want to give Anaroop the floor as well. I know he has some courses, some things brewing.
No, for sake of time, I'm going to keep it like, nice and streamlined there. But I think that aspect that you mentioned around being able to speak to the commonality between people, right? That shared cultural value, the shared cultural subscription that's there. We had a great example we had talked about ourselves, is that Lana and myself, both of our lifestyles, the things that we work on are pretty much the same, but you're going to see subtle differences in, the things that we wear, the things that we consume and so forth, right? But then there is a lot of commonality that's there. I would love to get an idea from you when you think about how the definition of culture has gotten, let's say in colloquial terms, more shallow in the sense that how did it get, watered down to, oh, it's a demographic or it is people of a certain ethnicity or so forth, right? What are some reasons that's happening and what's perpetuating those?
Oh man, because culture is hard AF. I mean, it's a very complicated idea. It's like explaining water to a fish. It's in everything and it is everything. How do you explain that to someone? That's why when we talk about culture, it tends to sort of become this amorphous, esoteric, abstract idea because it is. And I wrote the book because of that very reason, and not just to help people get other people to move, but because this thing that we engage in our daily lives, the most influential external force on our daily lives, is so ill-informed that we are therefore so ill-equipped to navigate it, let alone lead it and have agency with regards to how we engage in it. So I think about culture through the lens of Emil Durkheim, one of the founding fathers of sociology. He talks about culture as a system, an operating system, a governing operating system at that demarcates who we are and govern what people like us do, right? It is the way by which we see the world and ultimately translate it. And this kind of leads to a more contemporary definition of culture by a gentleman named Raymond Williams. He's one of the most profound contributors to the cultural studies in any, in our given time. And he defined culture many ways. He said his favorite definition of culture was that culture is a realized signifying system. It's a way by which we make meaning. And it is unbelievably powerful, right? So you take Durkheim's idea of it's an operating system and Raymond Williams' idea that it's a meaning-making system, then you start to get some concreteness around what culture is. And to your point, when you start to see the world through this construct of what culture is, you start to see just how loosey-goosey we are with the way in which we talk about it. If you're in marketing and you hear people say, let's get our idea out into culture, which is a normal refrain, something we talk about very, very often, something you'd hear in the halls of just about every organization, definitely in just about every creative advertising agency. But you ask them to define culture, and they go, you get a million different definitions. You get 50 different definitions, And when they really mean, when these institutions, when these companies, when we say, let's get our ideas out into culture, what they really mean is let's get our ideas out into popularity, where culture is essentially a shortcut for popularity. But those two things are distinctly different. Popularity is the extent to which something is known. It's about pervasiveness. But culture is a meaning-making system. It's about meaning. And there are a lot of things that are popular that don't have very much meaning, right? And there are a lot of things that are meaningful that aren't very popular. These things are not, they're not equated. They're not the same. And understanding the differences, understanding the bifurcation between the two, the abstracts, the jargon, the ill-equipped language, vocabulary that we had to describe culture, we see just how far it is from what culture actually is. We realize just how handicapped we are in our ability to navigate through it.
No, absolutely. That is amazing. And It prompted so many different things when you think about certain aspects, right? Like one question that comes up for my mind is around the concept of authorship, right? And authorship in the sense of when we look at, how we think about the social media trends, and so how they keep becoming more postmodern in the sense that everything is an abstraction of the other thing and things are
Yeah.
trending. And before it was a matter of going with, you want to take things and you want to add your spin to it. But we're seeing a lot of just let's just rehash, and so forth, right? And my question to you was around that aspect of when you think about like the power law dynamics of those things, right? So when you think about as culture is propagated, let's say somebody comes up with a dance on a TikTok, right? Or somebody comes up with a certain interesting trend or funny video. Now that keeps getting co-opted, it keeps going upwards, right? Because now, because of the popularity, you have somebody who has, let's say, a large scale following, whether that be a corporation, whether that be a high level, creator, somebody who has millions of followers. Now there's so many people who they're discovering that particular cultural artifact per se, right? Like
Yeah.
as a result of that person who has the skill, but then the authorship somewhere gets lost. So I was curious about how you think about those things as we continue to, evolve with those
That is a
aspects.
really, really pointed question. It's a good question. When I hear it, it reminds me of an old idea. An idea is covers in music, right? Derivative works, if you will. And the idea of covers is that an artist will take a work that someone else created and put their spin on it. In some ways, it's sort of mimetic in nature. It's like memes. I'm gonna take a thing and then I'm gonna recontextualize it through my own experiences, through my own idiosyncratic givings, or whatever the case may be. And then so you ask yourself, well, does the diversification of work, the derivative works rather, that is produced, does it dilute and take away from the actual initial creation, assuming it wasn't exploitative in nature, right? And to that I go, well, maybe, sure. I mean, sure, yeah, by some degree there is some degradation for sure, but it also creates more doors into the core idea. Example, back to this, to covers as a proxy for this, as a metaphor for this. In the 1970s, a soul singer named Roberta Flack covered a lovely ballad called "Killing Me Softly," right? Gorgeous ballad, and it was a smash hit. Roberta Flack's version was far more popular than the original. Then in the 80s, a gentleman by the name of Al B. Sure covered that Roberta Flack song in a much more contemporary R&B style. I had never heard the original Roberta Flack version before I heard Al B. Sure's version. But I hear Al B. Sure's version, and it introduces me into Roberta Flack. You fast forward some 15 years later from Al B. Sure, and you get three artists from New Jersey who go by the name the Fugees, and they create their version of "Killing Me Softly," which is hard drums, far more street and hip hop influenced than the smooth version of Al B. Sure or the soul version of Roberta Flack or the original version. All these things, however, introduce us into the song "Killing Me Softly." And you may be like, "Look, dude, I'm too street. I don't do that like soft R&B stuff, son. I need hard drums, B." And therefore, the Fugees version is the gateway for you into the idea. But maybe you go, "Listen, I'm more of a quiet storm kind of guy. I like smooth, high falsettos." So therefore, I'll be sure brings you into the idea. The net of all this is that each door provides a contextual expression of the core idea that bring people in. Is it degrading to the original version? Sure, I don't even know the original version's author or the artist who performed it first, but the core idea I know quite well. And we see this with the song Imagine and so on and so on and so on. The same thing goes with creative expressions in the world of marketing. Memes, posts, etc. These things are often recontextualized and brought to a broader audience, which is why there's this social norm that when you are recreating someone's stuff, make sure that you tag the original creator so it's not lost in the derivative work.
Yeah, very well explained. Appreciate that. I wanted to touch a little bit on something you said earlier as well. We talked about like popularity versus what's meaningful. And in my discussion too with different founders or just people in the industry of marketing, you find that people, they want that popularity, right? And so they may create in order to produce or try to achieve that virality versus, let's say, the meaningful work that they do that is very meaningful, may not get that much reach, that much visibility, that much engagement, but it's actually the real thing. It's actually what's meaningful. And so founders could find themselves in the thought of, well, why isn't this getting more engagement, or why isn't this getting more attention? Because it's so meaningful. And so how do you, what is your answer to them when they find themselves in that paradox of confliction and tension?
This is where network effects become so powerful. When we talk about like reach and attention, the conventional wisdom is that I'm going to do a thing, I'm going to say a thing, and it is going to touch and reach many, many people, from me to you, in a certain-off law broadcast system. A lot of people listen to me, my voice is going to be spoken, and such it will be. But the truth of the matter is, especially in a world that is mediated by social networking platforms, that is fragmented across different interests, platforms, and the like, it's less likely that me to you will be the reach that comes from it. Rather, me to you, to your friends, and to their friends, and so on and so on and so on. That reverberation, those network effects, is how we get the reach that we're after. So when we are designing messages and products for a particular group of people, sometimes if you think about the intermediaries that are going to get those ideas to those people. So our aim isn't reach at first. Our aim should be impact and meaning for the initial. Because if we knock over that domino, it will then lead to another domino knockover, and so on and so on and so on. Also, there is something to be said about cultural relevance over media reach. Case in point. Do you know the number one song streamed last year was by an artist named Sabrina Carpenter? Her song was Espresso. Huge record, big record, right? And it was a bop. That was the joint, right? It was popular. But juxtapose Espresso with They Not Like Us, Kendrick Lamar. That song was not as popular as Espresso, but the cultural impact of Not Like Us was unbelievable, because we didn't just listen to Not Like Us and play in the club and dance to and all those things, but that song catalyzed discourse about what does it mean to be a part of a genre, and who has access to being a genre. And can you be a part of a genre if you didn't have the lived experiences that shaped the genre? I mean, these things helped us define meaning within the world in which we navigate. And, sure, would Kendrick Lamar like the popularity of Sabrina Carpenter's Espresso? I'm certain, absolutely, right? But the impact Sabrina Carpenter can never have. And then the idea here is that sometimes in our want to get reach, we forget what actually drives people to move. And that's cultural relevance. Do people like me do something like this?
That's awesome. That's awesome. That was perfect. You landed that very, very well. Thank you so much for that answer. So as we shift just a little bit, I wanted to get into the thought of personal branding, as it were. And so when we think about, like, even yourself, if, Dr. Marcus Collins, right? If, your personal branding and what you do and what draws an audience or a tribe around your ideas and your thought leadership and so forth. So if your personal brand were a moment in culture, what moment would it be?
Oh man, if my personal brand was a moment in culture, what moment would it be? Um, for the thing that comes to me at the moment is the great schism, if it were. Nah, I'm joking. This is probably the Protestant Reformation. This is Martin Luther nailing the letter on the wall of the church saying, y'all doing this wrong, right? That the way we're thinking about this is wrong. And I feel like this moment in time right now, the work that I'm doing is in many ways that it is subverting the orthodoxy of how we think about the world, especially the world of business, and in particular, the world of business and consumption, commerce. And I feel like I've been on a bit of a crusade, if you will, to keep with the religious theological metaphor, of not only sort of posing a referendum of the status quo, sort of a protest, i.e., Protestant protest of the normal orthodoxy of how we think about marketing and how we engage in it, but also sort of enlightening the way we think, the way we talk about it, providing a better Rosetta Stone about culture being such a dominant influence on consumption and the role that marketers play in it and its impact on marketing. We talk about personal brand. Brand by definition is an identifiable signifier. It's a vessel of meaning that conjure up thoughts and feelings in the hearts and minds of people, which means then brands are interpreted through cultural lenses because culture is the way by which we make meaning. And therefore, brands don't have a choice but to be cultural objects, cultural artifacts. So personal brands, this is about our personal meaning. What do we want to mean in the world? And if my my calculations are correct, the meaning I've been trying to establish is one that challenges the orthodoxy, not because I believe that our intentions are wrong and our skill sets are anemic, but rather that our worldview is just too narrow. And I, for one, have benefited from widening the aperture as a practitioner, but even more importantly, as a fellow citizen of this thing that we call social living.
Love it, love it. And just stand on that topic too is, so what are the 5 songs on your playlist, right, that best explain how you think about culture? Now, of course, reading your book, I would imagine that one of them comes from a Tribe Called Quest, as it were. But what would be those 5 songs on your playlist?
Oof, the song title is going to be difficult, but I'll do you one better. I'll give you artists and say why these artists.
There you go.
So Tribe Called Quest, 1000%. What Tribe did is something that was so unique to the marketplace, particularly to hip hop. Because even though their predecessors, like the Jungle Brothers and De La Soul, completely, turned hip hop on its head, Tribe was able to take those sensibilities and marry it to the operating system of hip hop at the time, right? And I feel like that's what I try to do as a cultural translator, taking what we know about culture from an academic lens and applying it to how we engage with culture as a practicing lens, right? So that's the first. The second would be Frank Ocean, right? Frankie O. 'Cause here's an artist who chooses to operate on his own predilections, right? He's not going to follow the traditional path for an artist. He's going to write his own rules. And I feel like in many ways I'm trying to do that. I'm aspiring to do that very thing. The third would be Boys to Men. Why? Because they are standard setters, right? They took the harmonies of barbershop quartets. They took the the arrangements of a Take Six, and they took the R&B stylings of vocalizations with runs and put them all together to create R&B as we knew it in the 90s, which still reverberates today. So Boyz II Men has to be in there. D'Angelo,
For sure.
God rest his soul.
Nice.
You know, D'Angelo brought neo soul to the zeitgeist and continue to reshape it, to bend it, to contort it, so that neo soul, even though we didn't call it that after the early 2000s, still found a home in the world. I mean, in his music spanned over decades, right, and still have the same sort of sensibilities, right? So that's that. And the last here, and certainly not the least, I gotta say John B. And here's why John B. Because John B is an outsider operating in the inside, right? Here's this white guy who's made his entire career singing soul music and stayed true to the culture the entire time. You haven't heard John B get into any smoke with regards to like
Facts.
acting or stepping out of place, right? He's been firmly set in it. And I feel like that's how I've operated. You know, like I'm not an academic, historically I've come to this place and I've tried to be true to it accordingly. I didn't come from marketing originally, right? But I tried to be true to it accordingly. So I also feel like I'm a visitor in these worlds that I operate in, but I've been able to make myself at home, if I could say that humbly.
No, that's perfect. That's impactful. That's powerful. And my last question, just staying on the topic of artists, is Beyonce. Walk us through that experience and the thing that you learned working with her. And when we think about facilitating community and what people believe and finding your tribe and finding your congregation and then preaching the gospel, as it were, can you walk us through your experience there?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question to ask, especially to sort of book in the interview here. Beyonce is an artist for sure. She makes music, she sings, she dances, she acts, she creates products, she does all these things, right? She is artistic. She is very, very artistic. But Beyonce is a shortcut for something else. She's a brand. She has meaning beyond what she does. Right, Beyonce is a shortcut for women's empowerment. Every song we think of Beyonce has some sort of signaling of women's empowerment, whether it's no, can you pay my bills? I'm a survivor, to the left, replaceable, who runs the world, girls, get information, you ain't gonna break my soul. Like Beyonce is constantly advocating for women's empowerment and has changed the manner in which it's been communicated over the years so that is contextual to the backdrop in which she's operated. And her fans are people who listen to her music, but her community are people who see the world the way she does, right? The Beehive. And I learned this working for Beyonce, trying to aggregate and build a community of fans for her, right? But I realized you don't build community, you facilitate it, right? And Beyonce has seen so much success from moving the goalpost from let's activate fans to let's engage community, people who see the world that we do, and her resources, her music, the things that she put in the world, they're all expressions of these shared beliefs that help activate people who abide by them. It's been one of the most powerful lessons that I've learned in my career. And, like they say, you learn from failure more than you do from success. And trying to launch her fan club was a failure for me. But coming to find the idea of engaging community like her and the Beehive has been a lesson that stuck with me ever since, and probably would be one of the most important observations that I've been able to bring to the marketplace, I think.
Very well said. Thank you so much for that. And Anurup, any last thoughts, of course?
Absolutely. I think it's so important for everybody who's watching this. For us, of course, we named the podcast Culture X Commerce because we wanted to add that aspect of culture and how important it is commerce is there, but culture takes the first seat, right? As far as that goes. One thing I'd love to learn from you, right, as you think about how things are going and how we're growing and so forth, is going to be on the topic of, we talked about derivative work earlier in this interview, right? And I want to talk about the concept with AI and all the different things how it's, there's this whole aspect of the dead internet theory where essentially you're going to have so much content created and so forth that's there. Is there a scope or potential that we have to be weary of, that there may also be a quote unquote dead space in culture, right? Just due to the level of mass creation. So is there a potential dead culture theory also?
That's a good shout. My initial thought is no, because to say that there is a dead culture would be sort of an evaluation on something I think is value neutral. Culture is what it is. It's not good or bad. It just is, depending on who you are. For Martin Luther, go back to that example. He thought that the culture of Catholicism was bad, but I bet Catholics didn't think so. I imagine people who are of different religious leanings probably has some criticism on other people's culture. Is it good or is it bad? It's neither. It just is. And that's been the biggest learning for me in writing this book, and sort of evangelizing it subsequently, is that, things aren't the way they are the way that we are. That the world isn't objective, it's subjective. And the way we see the world ultimately informs the way the world manifests to our senses. So what may seem like slop to one group of people may be like, this is actually kind of cool, So you can't yuck their yum. But instead, think about what are the ramifications of it. So if we didn't say, dead culture, like dead internet, but instead saying a culture is not as vibrant as it once was, then that's actually quite fair to say. That there is a scenario where the culture loses its vibrancy, and that's when we prioritize the engineer over the artisan. That we spend more time thinking about the efficiency and productivity and the conveniences the technology provides, as opposed to the creations, the wonders of the artisan that helps forward culture by bringing cultural production that helps us see the world differently and reflect ourselves in the world accordingly.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
Very well said. Well, thank you so much, Marcus, for joining us for Culture X Commerce. If you could, leave the audience with something, especially founders and, who are creating products and facilitating community. Anything you want to leave with them, and also what's next for you and what you're working on and where people can find you and stay in touch.
So for founders, I tell them this, that consumption is a cultural act. What we wear, what we drive, what we use, where we go to school, if we go to school, who we marry, if we marry, where we vacation, what we eat, how we bury the dead, if we bury the dead. These things are all byproducts of our cultural subscription. So if you are engaged in commerce, you are being influenced by culture, or culture is influencing how your products are seen, how they are evaluated, and ultimately whether or not they are adopted. So to ignore culture is the equivalent to ignoring the biggest cheat code that you aren't using, right? So quick, fast, in a hurry, I would recommend getting a better understanding of culture. That's for founders. What I'm working on these days are twofold. One, I'm finishing up my manuscript for my next book, which will explore the culture of work, right? So if For the Culture is about the culture of consumption, this book is about organizational culture, how we engage in the collective production of work, and what are the mechanisms at play when that happens. Likewise, I'm launching a podcast like you guys in January called From the Culture, which explores organizational culture, right? This is about looking at the front stage and the backstage simultaneously, realizing that the front stage of production is only as good as the operations in the backstage.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to that. From the Culture. That's a perfect name for it as well. So no, thanks for sharing it with us. And we look forward to tuning in and checking it out.
Thanks, man. Appreciate y'all for having me, fam.
All right, now, take care. Until next time.